All right, everybody, welcome. Thank you so much for coming tonight to our presentation on Cal Crim. I really want to thank Greg Hand for being a part of this. Definitely want to thank Bill Buki and the Greater Cincinnati Police Museum for being here tonight and bringing a couple of Cal Crim artifacts with us. Make sure you check that out. And really, again, just thanks to you guys for being here. My name's Kent Mulcahy. I'm a reference librarian down in the Information and Reference Department, along with my colleague Brian Powers from Genealogy and Local History. We've put together a series of 3 events dealing with the 1919 White Sox scandal, the Black Sox scandal. This is obviously the first one in the series. On Saturday morning at 9:45, we'll be meeting here. How many of you guys have heard of American Legacy Tours, the walking tours company? So they will be giving a tour, their 1919, the year that changed baseball tour. Normally that's a $25 ticket. If you register, you're on the library's bill for this one. So we'll pick up the tab for that if people are interested in joining us for that. It's very strict registration though. So if anyone here's interested in that tour, see me afterwards. I've got something pulled up over here. We can register you right now. So let me know if you have questions about that. But we're going to meet here, go over some resources that we have for sports history buffs and history buffs in general. Then we'll meet down on Fountain Square. It's about a 3/4 of a mile walk. It's a flat walk. And guess what? Did anyone look at the temperatures for Saturday? Yeah, so let's take advantage of this. So again, come see me if you have questions about the walking tour, please, afterwards. The third event also will take place on Saturday the 5th at 3 o'clock. That's going to be a discussion with Greg Rhodes and Greg Gagis, the third of the Gregs, in case anybody didn't notice that. But see, everyone always says, oh, you know, the White Sox threw the series. That's the only reason why the Reds won. No, I don't really think so. So we're going to try to tell Cincinnati's story a little bit about that side of the scandal. That's at 3 o'clock. The Reds Hall of Fame has been generous enough to let us borrow way more than I expected of stuff from the 1919 series. So we're going to have 2 display, 3 maybe, I'm not even sure. It's a lot of stuff they're giving us. But we'll have that on display. And again, that talks at 3. That one, free, registration's free, just, you know, show up. And, you know, in between the walk and the tour, feel free to stop by Arnold's and eat where the Reds might have eaten, you know, during the scandal. Who knows, right? I mean, we're going to say that's part of the event. So before everyone leaves, there's some books you can check out on the table, flyers for the events. On the back, I have a couple of papers from the era of Cal Crim, 1901, that are kind of highlighting one of the bigger moments in his career, if anyone wants to check that out. That's also where the artifacts that were kindly brought by the Greater Cincinnati Police Museum are. And okay, after all that, I'd like to introduce Mr. Greg Hand. He is the proprietor of the Cincinnati Curiosities blog, and he's retired from the University of Cincinnati, where he provided communication and public relations counsel for 36 years. My spouse is a librarian there, and she remembers getting emails from him all the time. So, he was an editor of the Western Hills Press before his employment with the university, and in retirement, it seems like, he contributes regularly to Cincinnati Magazine and to WCPO TV's Cincy Lifestyle Show. So let's all thank him for coming out tonight.
Well, thank all of you for coming out on this heated evening. I'm going to ask you to join me as I take a leisurely stroll over to the Grand Hotel. Not too far from here, it's about 9 blocks. But we're going to take this stroll going back in time. Now the Grand Hotel, no? The Grand Hotel was the home of an organization called the 10-Minute Club back in the 1890s. The 10-Minute Club got its name because the members had an agreement that every 10 minutes they would order another round of drinks. The Grand Hotel, alas, is no more, over there at the corner of 3rd and Central. But we can imagine an evening at the Grand Hotel in November of 1894. On this occasion, the 10-Minute Club is gathered together to toast the success of Cal Crim, who had just been promoted to the post of police detective. So among the imbibers that night were this guy. This is Ban Johnson. At the time that the 10-Minute Club would have met in November of 1894, he was the sports editor of the Cincinnati Commercial Gazette. Across the table, we have Charles Comiskey. Comiskey was the player manager for the Cincinnati Reds in 1894. And we might see a young cub reporter, a guy named Hugh Fullerton, who worked for Ban Johnson at the Commercial Gazette. Now, all of these were young men at the time. Comiskey was the oldest. He was only 34. Cal Crim would have been 29. Johnson was 30, and Hugh Fullerton was only 20 years old. Every one of these folks is going to play a role in what became known as the Black Sox scandal of 1919. This imaginary meeting might well have happened. All four of these people, Cal Crim, Ban Johnson, Charles Comiskey, Hugh Fullerton, were all in Cincinnati at this time. It is known definitively that Johnson and Comiskey at least were members of the real 10-Minute Club, and they all knew one another. Now, thanks to the Greater Cincinnati Police Museum, you can actually see an example of one of these plates over there on the display. And it's a good introduction to Cal Crim himself. You know, when I was younger, I used to see these around town. They were a lot more popular when Cal's Detective Bureau was still operational in Cincinnati. It's since been merged and bought out and moved and that sort of thing. But you used to be able to see these plates around town fairly often. And I'd see that Cal Crim, thinking to myself, it's got to be an abbreviation for something, you know, like California Criminal, or, you know, what is this? But in fact, this is a real human being. This is David Calvin Crim, and he was a legend in Cincinnati. Now you might ask, what kind of legend? How legendary? Let's take a look at this guy, William Howard Taft, proud son of Cincinnati. President of the United States in October of 1910, when he returned to Cincinnati for a brief visit. So the city officials took him out to the House of Refuge. They took him to a number of public institutions, showing off the good work being done in the city. And there's kind of a motorcade. So there's the president with his car full of dignitaries, and then there's a security detail, and then a bunch of out-of-town reporters, and then way in the back there's the White House staff taking up another car. And as they're going through Cincinnati, the out-of-town reporters all wrote in their stories that the crowds, as they passed, said exactly the same thing. There goes President Taft and Cal Crim. So he was like that legendary. So David Calvin Crim was born in Maryland around 1864. There's a legend that he ran away from home as a barefoot boy, stealing a lift on a freight train into Cincinnati to look for his long-lost married sister. One of the reasons that story is repeated is because Cal told it so many times, but the problem is none of his sisters were married at the time he came to Cincinnati. His parents were both alive, and so he would occasionally say that he was running away from an orphanage. It's far more likely that he just decided to head west in search of opportunity. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad line ran right through his birthplace of Oakland, Maryland, and it came right into Cincinnati, and it was located where the Longworth Hall is located today. Despite the fact that Cal said that he was essentially a babe in arms when he came to Cincinnati, he was probably more like 16 or 17 years old, and he found work as a bellhop at the old Galt House Hotel down on 6th and Main, and later out in Brighton at the Brighton Hotel, which serviced the stockyards out in that area. That the now vacant German National Bank is located approximately where the Brighton Hotel was located. In 1885, Cal was joined in marriage to a young lady named Fanny Alexander at St. Luke's Protestant Episcopal Church, and decided that he needed something a little more rewarding financially to take care of his marriage. At the time, he was working as a barber, and so he decided to become a police officer. Legend has it that when Cal showed up for his first day of work in the police department, he brought a basket of fried chicken for lunch that was promptly confiscated by the sergeant. Now, if you know any police sergeants, there's a ring of truth to that particular legend. The police at the time used the media as a form of job security. If your exploits, capturing criminals, solving crimes, that sort of thing, made the newspapers, it was a form of job security. You know, nobody wanted to get rid of the star police officers, and Cal was actually pretty good at getting his name in the headlines or the lead sentence of the stories. But his first really big media splash was, in fact, a scandal. The gist of it is Cal's wife had an affair with his boss. And Cal ended up divorcing his wife. Now, throughout this ordeal, the newspapers at the time were unanimous that they were in Cal's favor. They used to describe him as Happy Cal Crim, the dashing police officer, the handsome young officer who patrols on Vine Street in the vicinity of 9th, which happens to be where we are tonight, and noted that none of the patrolmen stood higher than he with the people at headquarters. So after becoming a detective, Cal got the break of his life when he was invited over to Kentucky, first day of February in 1896. Campbell County Sheriff Jewel Plummer had a problem, and he had no detectives on his own staff. What happened was the headless body of a young woman had been discovered on a farm just outside Fort Thomas. Now, when Cal and his partner, Jack McDermott, arrived, they found a scene that would have horrified modern crime scene investigators. There were dozens of curiosity seekers and tourists trampling over the crime scene. grabbing blood-soaked branches for souvenirs, and snatching away any evidence that they could find. But in this case, the dead and headless girl, whose name was Pearl Bryan, made Cal Crim famous, following what little evidence had not been trampled on or stolen. Crim and McDermott pieced together the tragic story of this young girl from a small town in Indiana who loved a young man unwisely. She was seduced and abandoned by this smooth-talking Lothario, a guy named Scott Jackson. She informed Jackson that she was pregnant. She was lured to Cincinnati by Jackson on the promise of marriage. Jackson drugged her, hauled her out onto this desolate country lane, and decapitated her while she was apparently still alive. Her head has never been found. Jackson was unrepentant to the last. He implicated his roommate, Scott Walling. He had multiple opportunities to suggest that Walling was an innocent participant in this action and declined to do so. And both Walling and Jackson were hanged at Newport on March 20, 1897. And this murder inspired popular songs, poetry, hundreds of newspaper articles, and the now world-famous ghost story about Pearl Bryan haunting Bobby Mackey's saloon over in Wilder, Kentucky. Most of these legends come down to Pearl's shoes. And this was evidence of Cal Crim's brilliance as a police detective, because back then you really didn't have fingerprint files. If you've got a headless body, how do you determine who it is? And throughout this investigation, hundreds of families are calling the police department and saying, I think it's my daughter. I think it's my daughter. There were just lots of missing people. Cal was given a hint that the number printed in Pearl Bryan's shoes were going to crack the case. And sure enough, by using that number, he found the manufacturer located where those shoes were sold. That led Cal and McDermott out to Greencastle, Indiana, where they discovered Pearl's family and learned the whole story and solved this particular murder. Now, as astute as he was, Cal really miscalculated 5 years later in 1901. And in fact, you can see the stories about this miscalculation laid out there on the table tonight. Cal was on his way out of town. He had a date to hunt rabbits with a fellow police officer. And he happened to spot this guy, Dan Foley, known as the Goat. Foley the Goat. Foley was a notorious stiff grafter and molly buzzer. Now, a stiff grafter was somebody who pickpocketed at funerals. And a molly buzzer was a pickpocket who specialized in women's purses. So Foley was a stiff grafter and a molly buzzer. He picked ladies' purses at funerals. High-class criminal. Crim stepped off a 6th Street trolley, corrals Dan Foley, explains to him that he's under arrest. Foley thought otherwise, pulled out a small caliber revolver from his coat and fired 2 bullets into Crim at point-blank range. Foley took off down 6th Street, waving his gun to keep people away. Crim slumped against the wall of the Palace Hotel, which is today the Cincinnati Hotel, shouted, "That man shot me, catch him." Crim was hospitalized for 6 months. Almost every day, Cincinnati newspapers published reports on his condition. Citizens of Cincinnati were so taken with his story, they took up a collection and they paid off the mortgage on the house that he had just purchased in Hyde Park. And this is the house, and it's still there, 3335 Menlo Lane. So in 1913, Ralph Crawford, who was the chief of detectives at the time, retired, and Cal got promoted into the position of chief of detectives in an acting capacity. And he was very effective. His single year, he spent only 1 year in that role, he recovered $129,000 out of the $140,000 reported stolen in Cincinnati during that year, so approximately 90%. And in addition, his detectives recovered every single automobile stolen in Cincinnati during that year. So regardless, Cal got caught up in a political situation. He was a lifelong Democrat. Boss Cox's machine was Republican, back and forth on the civil service. And Cal saw the handwriting on the wall, and so he filed for retirement based on disability from the wounds caused by Foley the goat 12 years earlier. Within days of his retirement, he had a new job as the chief of detectives in the brand new Hotel Gibson. He had a staff of 8 there. And now that he was a private employee, he could bring his politics out into the open. Cal ran for sheriff on a couple of occasions, and he was really quite innovative. He used newsreel to promote his political campaign. He had commercials that played in the local Nickelodeon theaters. He would make personal appearances with his 3 daughters. He lost in 1914. He lost again when he ran as an anti-machine candidate in 1922. And in later years, Cal would tell this story about running for sheriff, and he'd say, yeah, I ran for sheriff, but I didn't run fast enough. After a couple of years, he left the Gibson Hotel, and he organized the Cal Crim Detective Bureau with a partner named Paul Ryan. Now, Paul Ryan actually had a detective bureau in operation, but he knew the brand value of Cal Crim, and so when they merged, he let Cal Crim get the name, and was kind of the silent partner for the rest of their arrangement. Crim's cachet was so strong that he even endorsed this aluminum knuckles as a security measure, you know. With Cal Crim involved, the Detective Bureau grabbed tons of headlines. At the time, very few police departments had their own detective bureau, and so, especially in rural areas. And so when a big crime would occur, they would recruit private detectives to come in and work with the police to help solve things. So Crim got into the machine politics of Canton, Ohio, to solve the assassination of a crusading newspaper editor named Don Millette. They did the investigation of Leon Renneker, who was known as the Turkey King of Winchester, Kentucky, and they were convicted, or they were the ones who convicted a guy named Jacob Nesbitt in the bathtub slaying of his young bride in Troy, Ohio. So with his nose for news, it's kind of remarkable that one of Cal's biggest stories did not make headlines until years after the fact, and that was his investigation of the gambling connected to the Black Sox baseball scandal of 1919. So in general, thanks to dozens of books, some of which are on display here, the movie 8 Men Out, a lot of people know the general gist of the story, and that was that the Chicago White Sox collaborated with a number of gamblers to throw the World Series in the Cincinnati Reds' favor for thousands of dollars in payoffs. Generations of young boys grew up hearing the story about the young man who confronted Shoeless Joe Jackson outside the courthouse and said, "Say it ain't so, Joe." Most of the modern versions of the Black Sox legend kind of ignore the fact that the scandal really didn't come to light for almost a year after the 1919 World Series, and that no one was ever criminally convicted of participating in this illegal activity in any way, shape, or form. Crim's participation was downplayed for years because he really was operating as a very private detective on behalf of one of the key individuals involved in baseball at the time, and that was his old pal, Ban Johnson. Now, between 1894 and 1919, Johnson had left newspapering. He had gotten involved in a minor league baseball league, and turned that league into what is now the American League. He became the president of the American League, and in 1919, that meant that that he was one of a triumvirate that ran baseball. The way it worked is the president of the American League, the president of the National League were each on this commission, and then there was a tiebreaker. And in 1919, that tiebreaker happened to be the president of the Cincinnati Reds baseball club, a guy named Gary Herman, Augustus Herman, who was one of Boss Cox's lieutenants. Now, even though Herman was the tiebreaker, Johnson really called the shots, and it turned out that Johnson had a huge dispute going with his old friend, Charles Comiskey. Basically, Johnson, as the league president, was insisting on fair play and respecting the umpires and toning down rowdy fan behavior. And Comiskey, as an owner, wanted money, 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 money. And so that's the TLDR of their dispute. Johnson knew that Comiskey had hired detectives to investigate the allegations about cheating in the 1919 World Series. But Johnson believed that Comiskey was hiring a detective to collect all the evidence to bury it. Because if this scandal came out, if it came out that in fact the World Series had been tampered with, it was possible that Comiskey was going to lose some of his best players. And so this was the belief of Johnson that he needed to get his own detective out there to start collecting evidence before Comiskey could destroy it. While all these rumors were floating back and forth, there was one voice crying in the wilderness, claiming throughout the entire year of 1920 that the series had been fixed, and that was Hugh Fullerton, who is now a nationally known sports writer. Here's a newspaper out of New Orleans which syndicated his writing, bragging that they were the ones who broke the story because his story appeared in their newspaper. The Reds, of course, are not going to admit that anything was going on because they're the world champions. And announcing that, hey, we think it was fixed is in essence confessing that we didn't deserve to win. The suspects are innumerable at this time. You know, when we think of the sports pages today, we think of what we call sports. And sports are baseball and football and basketball and tennis and some track events. And, you know, these are sports and they're athletics and all that. At the time, 1919, sports still meant gambling. There were men who, in the city directories, list their occupation as sporting man. That was an announcing to the world, I'm a gambler. Get in touch with me if you want to sit down for a game of poker. You know, get in touch with me if you want the odds on the next boxing match. The sports pages in 1919 were nothing like the sports pages today. Every single sport that appeared on the sports pages in 1919 involved gambling, boxing, baseball, horse racing. Those were the three sports at the time. You're occasionally in 1919 starting to get reports of college football, little tiny print for basketball games, but these are really the sports at that time. So if you're investigating this scandal, the difficulty comes down to trying to find the weak link, trying to find somebody who's going to spill the beans, trying to find somebody who's got a gripe about what was going on. And so Comiskey hired a detective out of Indiana who went out to the West Coast and to Detroit, checking out the stories from the players, his own players. Got quite a few pages of evidence, but the players just weren't talking. A softer target were the gamblers themselves. It turns out that the gamblers double-crossed the players, but they also double-crossed each other. And they believed that the players double-crossed them. So the gamblers are the ones that really created the weak link. You know, it was likely if you could get one of the gamblers to talk about this, that they would come out with the truth, if only to get even with one of the other conspirators. There's so many gamblers involved in this operation that you almost need a scorecard to determine which gambler was betting on which game. Top of the batting order would be this guy, Arnold Rothstein. So if you've seen almost every one of the gamblers that I'm mentioning tonight are played by somebody in the 8 Men Out movie. But for a long time it was believed that Arnold Rothstein was the one who coordinated the whole thing. Evidence now suggests that he certainly didn't originate it, and his role was probably less than he's given credit for over the years. He certainly knew about the fix. He betted accordingly, but the current opinion seems to be leaning in the direction that a lot of lesser gamblers were using Rothstein's name and reputation to push their own agenda. And in fact, in his testimony, eventually to the grand jury, Rothstein said the whole thing started when Abe Attell and some other cheap gamblers decided to frame the series and make a killing. The world knows I was asked in on the deal, and my friends know how I turned it down flat. I don't doubt that Abe Attell used my name to put it over. That's been done by smarter men than Abe. But I was not in on it, would not have gone into it under any circumstances, and did not bet a cent on the series after I found out what was underway. That last part is certainly untrue. So Abe Attell, Abraham Washington Attell, is a champion featherweight boxer. He was almost certainly in at the very center of at least one of the syndicates financing the World Series fix. He was approached by two former baseball players, Billy Maharg and Sleepy Bill Burns, because they knew that Abe knew Arnold Rothstein, and those two former baseball players were trying to get Attell to get Rothstein involved. The idea being Rothstein would front perhaps $100,000. They would give the $100,000 to the Chicago players, and the Chicago players would then intentionally lose the game. Other names that were also mentioned, like I said, you need a scorecard for this. John Sport Sullivan, he's from Boston. Carl Zork is from St. Louis. Ben Franklin from Omaha. And a couple more baseball players, Benny Kauf and Hal Chase of the New York Giants, and there are even more. Now, despite this geographic diversity, I mean, we're talking about suspects from Boston out to Omaha. When Cal Crim started his investigation, he basically walked down the street and talked to this guy. This is Fred Mowbray. Fred ran a lumber company out in the West End. He made a lot of money, and he spent a lot of money cozying up to the Cincinnati Reds baseball players. Mowbray was also close friends with a number of gamblers, including the Levi brothers, Ben Levi and Lou Levi of Des Moines, Iowa. It turns out that Fred Mowbray grew up with the two Levi brothers in Peru, Indiana. According to Bruce Allardyce, who's a professor of history in Chicago, what is certain is that the Levi's childhood friend, Cincinnati lumber baron and Reds booster club stalwart Fred Mowbray, knew all the players and loved to bet. And the summer of 1919, Ben Levi traveled to Cincinnati to visit his own old friend and used the well-liked, well-known Mowbray as his in to meet the players. A well-known private detective, and this is probably a reference to Cal Crim, viewed Ben talking with several of the players, actions that in retrospect seemed suspicious, but at that time seemed like just another routine instance of bettors talking to baseball players. And that's an important point because, as I said, everybody bet on baseball. And if you went down to the ballpark, you saw gamblers, and the gamblers were right there at the dugout talking to the players, trying to get an in, trying to get little pieces of information to put their bet on a better ground than their competitors, to get their odds to line up in their favor, that sort of thing. And Cal Crim, witnessing some of this stuff, discovered that in the run-up to the 1919 World Series, Ben Levi informed Mowbray, in fact, that the fix was on. The Levi brothers may have heard about the plot from Abe Attell because they were also connected to him. Attell claimed that the Chicago players, once they had agreed to throw the series in exchange for money, were peddling the fix around like a sack of popcorn, meaning nobody was keeping it secret. Mowbray used the knowledge that he had to wager heavily on the Reds, and he was rewarded with a lot of money. So close was Mowbray to these gamblers that Ben Levi asked Mowbray to hold on to $15,000. This is 1919 money, which were his winnings from just the first game of the series. Levi didn't want to carry that money around in a dangerous city like Cincinnati. And so he asked Mowbray to hold on to it. Mowbray covered that transaction by writing his own personal check and then deposited Levi's winnings in a safe deposit box at the Hotel Sinton down on 4th Street. Cal walked over in his investigation to the Hotel Sinton, and he talked to the desk clerk who produced a log showing, yes, indeed, there's a deposit on this day from Fred Mowbray, and the clerk described Mowbray's companion in such detail that Cal knew immediately that it was Ben Levi, a familiar face in the gambling circles here in Cincinnati. Cal gets back to his employer, Ban Johnson. Johnson gets the report and realizes Mowbray's fingering these other gamblers, but he's not confessing his own involvement. And so Johnson writes back to Cal, I have turned your report over to our attorney, Judge Barrett. The man who gave you the information in regard to Ben Levi did not uncork all he knew about the World Series fixing in 1919. It is my guess Levi gave this lumberman some information as to who would win the first 2 games. Don't you think it's possible to give this individual the 3rd degree and to make him tell all he knows? Well, the 3rd degree is not really Cal's style. Crim responds, Mowbray's vacationing in Arizona. He would not be back for weeks. Johnson writes back, we want to convict the Levi brothers, and if Mowbray won't come through clean, then it may be necessary for us to indict him. It's my thought you should treat him rough. It was your city that the sure thing gamblers made their great cleanup. And whether he gave him the 3rd degree or not, Crim got a lot of evidence from Mowbray, including Levi's canceled check for that $15,000. Yes, sir.
What's the date of that letter? What's the date of this correspondence?
I do not have it. This would have been in the spring of 1920. Another mystery that Cal unraveled involved the identity of a mystery man known to the White Sox players only as Bennett. In late September 1919, Abe Attell, remember the boxer, accompanied by a guy who he identified only as Bennett, met with Sleepy Bill Burns and Hal Chase in New York, the 2 former baseball players. Although Rothstein had told Attell, I'm not having anything to do with this, Attell brings this Bennett into the meeting and claims this is Rothstein's lieutenant. He's the sign that Big Arnold is behind this and you're going to get your money. The next day in Cincinnati, right before the first game, Attell and Bennett, again, met with 7 of the White Sox players in the Hotel Sinton. The only one who was absent was Shoeless Joe Jackson to discuss how the payouts are going to work. Throughout this whole conspiracy, Bennett's fingerprints were everywhere. He was the one who recruited the St. Louis gamblers to front money for this operation. He was the one who sweet-talked the New Yorkers into getting involved. He was the one who kind of intimidated the White Sox players, but who was he? And Crim was the one who discovered that Bennett is actually a guy named David Zeltzer. He's another one of the Des Moines, Iowa group. And According to Ralph J. Christian of the Society for American Baseball Research, SABR, David Zeltzer's role in fixing the 1919 World Series has been subject to various interpretations. In some accounts, he's viewed as the lieutenant of Rothstein, while others treat him as an assistant to Abe Attell or even Hal Chase. But none have gone so far as to suggest that he served as the ringleader of the gamblers. What has been overlooked in these interpretations is Zeltzer's tendency to avoid the limelight, his ability to team up with other gamblers, and the relationships he and his cohorts were able to establish with the ball players and team management, enabling them to obtain insider information that gave them a decided advantage in their betting activities. Once Crim cracked the Bennett identity question, it just opened up all sorts of avenues of inquiry that pointed at a dozen other conspirators. In particular, Crim showed that Zeltzer recruited Ben Franklin from Omaha to coordinate with the St. Louis gamblers. And despite that patriotic pseudonym, Ben Franklin was really Ben Frankel, and his family was law-abiding clothiers in Des Moines, Iowa. Franklin, in turn, brought Carl Zork into the mix. Zork was also in the clothing business in St. Louis. The 1919 World Series was not even Zork's first involvement with fixing games. Early in 1919, a St. Louis Cardinal named Jean Paulette conspired with gambler Zork to fix games, and it's often forgotten that it's not just 8 men out. A number of baseball players were banned from baseball at this time, one of which was Jean Paulette, who was conspiring with Carl Zork in St. Louis. And in fact, Cal Crim's focus on the St. Louis nexus for all of these activities so influenced the evidence that when Cook County's state's attorney, this guy, Robert Crow, sent out his indictments in May of 1921, he claimed that the World Series fix originated in St. Louis, specifically with Carl Zork and with Benjamin Franklin, rather than out on the East Coast with Arnold Rothstein, Sport Sullivan, and Abe Attell. And although he focused on the Midwest in his investigation, Cal Crim really did uncover a significant piece of evidence when he located the address of a guy named Remy Dorr in New York City. The thing about gamblers is they were never at the same address for more than about 6 or 7 months at a time. They moved around with the various games. If horse racing was going on, they'd be at Belmont or Saratoga. If baseball's going on, they're going to be in St. Louis, they're going to be in D.C. If boxing's going on, they may even be out west where they would put on matches to avoid the boxing laws. And so Remy Dorr was a person of interest that they really wanted to talk to, and nobody could find him. And Cal Crim located him in New York City. Dorr, even though he's a native of New Orleans, was a close friend of Fred Mowbray here in Cincinnati, and in fact sort of a protege. Mowbray often fronted the money for Remy Dorr's bets. He was mostly a racetrack gambler, but he also got involved in baseball games and that sorts of things. And there are lots of evidence that Dorr was the one placing Mowbray's bets throughout the 1919 World Series. For whatever reason, even though he was located, Dorr was never implicated in the trial. So Cal Crim turns over all of his evidence to Ben Johnson, who passes it on to the Cook County prosecutors, and dozens of witnesses came in and testified throughout 20. By September, it was obvious that the Chicago White Sox had 8 men out. Indictments were handed down against those players and 5 gamblers. The trial in July of 1921 resulted in not guilty verdicts for everyone involved. So as the indictments are handed down, Ban Johnson was on his way out of a job on the Baseball Commission. He remained president of the American League, but baseball reorganized, brought in the formidable Kennesaw Mountain Landis as the single commissioner of baseball, removing that triumvirate that had been in charge. And so among his final acts on the Baseball Commission, Johnson gave to Cal Crim a reward for the work that he had done. It was a gold-plated lifetime pass to any Major League Baseball park in the United States. And the word is that Cal used this pass a lot over the rest of his life. Many stories about Cal showing off his gold baseball pass over at Crosley Field. Cal turned 60 years old in 1924, and even though his name pops up in the newspapers, it's obvious that the heavy lifting at the detective agency had gone to his younger partners. Most of the articles after 1920 focus on his charitable work, particularly his interest in the boys' clubs, juvenile delinquency, and that sort of thing. Crim died in 1953 at the age of 89. He was still active in his detective agency. Almost all the obituaries that appeared in the newspaper at this time mentioned, finally, the investigation into the 1919 World Series. Cal's buried in the Vine Street Hill Cemetery right here in Cincinnati, where a great number of Cincinnati police officers, in fact, are buried from this time period. It took Susan Dellinger to describe Cal Crim's role in detail. Dellinger is the granddaughter of Ed Roush, who played on the 1919 Cincinnati Reds. She had approached some publishers about writing a biography of her grandfather and was basically told, you know, you can write about your grandfather, but we want a story about the 1919 Black Sox scandal. And so her book, Red Legs and Black Sox, is in print. You can get it through Amazon, that sort of thing. And it's really invaluable for researching this tawdry episode. In particular, she's one of the few researchers who focused on Cal Crim. And the reason for that is Dellinger became a member of the Society for American Baseball Research, SABR, and that gained her access into the archives at Cooperstown, where she found Crim's actual reports to Ban Johnson on file there in New York. She was allowed to read them. She was allowed to take notes. She was not allowed to make copies. And she told a newspaper, they have this report, but it's under lock and key. Thank you so much. Yes, sir.
Did Cal Crim have any association with George Remus, the famous bootlegger who was here in Cincinnati and had his headquarters at the Sentinel Hotel, the same place where they fixed it?
You know, I would be surprised if Cal Crim did not, personally know George Remus. There are any number of news items that indicate that reporters are totally impressed by the number of people that he knew. Remus was really active after Cal was kind of sliding out of an active role in his detective agency. So I'm sure that he knew him. In fact, frankly, I'd be surprised if Cal was not a customer. Yeah, but I don't believe that he was ever like investigating him or anything. Yes?
Did you run into John J. Ryan's name anywhere?
I did. I don't remember the context, and he may have been one of the people I just jettisoned to keep the story moving along. Yeah, he was, help me, he was,
He was a motorboat racer. He was a flim-flam stock, what do you call it when they sell pony shares of stock?
oh yeah, right. Okay. Yeah, he was in the lists of probable participants. But I don't remember Crim really chasing him. Yeah, that sort of thing. Yeah. Thank you very much. Please look at the displays back there, and please, if you have an opportunity, go visit the Greater Cincinnati Police History Museum. It is a wonderful resource in this city.
Where's that located?
It is on Reading Road, right before Sycamore.
308 Reading Road. There's a parking lot right on the corner to the next building, on the second floor.
Right, it's like a block north of Central Parkway, right behind the Alms and Ducky building, isn't it? Yeah.
Actually, it's behind the old furniture.
Yeah, Sun Furniture. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Really well done.
Thanks again to you guys for coming. I love it that part of my job is to be able to just come to things like this on the clock. So thank you so much for coming. I always go out of my way to thank people who come to the library, since parking is not as convenient as we wish it was. We know you guys could be anywhere, and so we really love it when you take some time out with us. If you have questions about the events that we're doing on Saturday, come see me. If you want to register for the walk, come see me. But really, thank you guys. Have a wonderful evening, and I hope to see you guys this Saturday. Thank you.